All right, let's go ahead and get started. So welcome everybody. My name's Scott, and today I'm going to be talking to you about Blazor, which is C# running in the browser on top of WebAssembly. So before we get too deep into things, I just want to talk about the audience I kind of had in mind when I made this. In case this doesn't sound like something for you, you can go find another talk. So mostly I targeted .NET developers, and I kind of mentioned this earlier, but how many people have done .NET at some point? About like most of the room. As well as if you're just a JavaScript developer, somebody who doesn't know any .NET, I think you'll also get something out of this talk as well. However, I did kind of target this mostly for .NET developers, but I think you'll also pick something up as well if you're just interested in WebAssembly. So what we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk about what is WebAssembly, what is Blazor, like what's the difference between those two. I'll do demos all throughout, and I'll probably hold off questions until the end if that's cool with everybody, because for a couple of reasons. One, this talk gets over at 6:40, and everybody's probably going to be hungry, so I want to get everybody out as fast as possible. Plus, when I've done this talk before and taken questions, I said a lot of times like, hey, yeah, I'm going to cover that, because this topic generates a lot of questions. So hopefully I'll hit most of your questions. But if not, I'll come up afterwards, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have. So what I hope you get out of this is not to be some sort of Blazor expert. I do think you will pick up some tips on how to get Blazor working on your own. However, what I hope you get out of this is you can just differentiate what is Blazor and what is WebAssembly, and then just get excited for the future and the possibilities that those two each bring together. So who am I? I'm a software consultant at a company called Lean Techniques, primarily .NET and JavaScript developer. I'm a big React fanboy, so what I'm doing right now is writing React every day at the client I'm at. I actually enjoy writing JavaScript. I know some people don't like writing JavaScript. However, I do enjoy writing JavaScript. I blog, and then I made some Blazor snippets for VS Code. Anybody use that by chance? Nobody? Just me and my parents still? Okay, that's cool. All right. So before we get into Blazor and WebAssembly, let's just level set as to what the current state of the SPA front end is. So let's say you get clearance to write a new SPA application. You have a few different decisions to make. One of the first ones you have to decide is what language are you going to use? Are you going to use the latest JavaScript? Are you going to use TypeScript, Flow, Reason, Elm, Clojure.js, whatever it is? That's kind of the first decision you have to make. And then you have to decide, all right, what framework am I going to use? Am I going to use React, Angular, Vue, Ember, Aurelia, latest hotness Svelte that just came out, or just straight up vanilla JS, which by the end of it, you'll probably end up creating your own framework, so maybe not that one so much. And then you got to pick your tool chain. Am I going to use Webpack? Am I going to use Babel? Am I going to use ESLint? Okay, cool, you're going to use ESLint. Now, what configuration are you going to use? Airbnb, Google, Common? All these different decisions that you have to make when you're starting on the SPA front end. And was anybody in Corey House's talk in this room right before this? A handful? Cool. So he has a Pluralsight course where he is talking about building a JavaScript development environment, where he outlines all these different choices that you have to make when you're building a JavaScript development environment. And I would actually argue that this isn't an extensive list. I would argue you probably have to make even more decisions than this. Because at the end of the day, you have to deal with JavaScript if you're doing a SPA front end. VBScript was a thing for maybe a half second. Flash was there for a little while, Silverlight, then Steve Jobs came in and killed them both. And now we pretty much are left with just dealing with JavaScript at the end of the day. So what problems does this create? Well, whether you are a JavaScript fanboy or not, you have to admit there's a bunch of people out there who don't like JavaScript. They come from a statically typed language like C#, Java, whatever it is. And they don't like the fact that JavaScript, you might have a typo, but you don't know until you go to run your app. Unless you're writing tests, of course, because everybody's writing tests, right? Right? Uncomfortable smiles? All right. So But then when your app blows up at runtime, whereas in one of those other statically typed languages, the compiler yells at you and says, hey, you made a typo there, and here's the line number, and you need to go fix it. The JavaScript ecosystem as well just has more integration or more stitching together and less integration. So you got to pull these different pieces together yourself. Browser support's a little sketchy sometimes, and there's tools to get around that. Moves really fast, and then npm and the no modules folder also gets some hate as well. As well as something I don't think is talked about enough is spas are just more expensive to maintain in general. Reason being, than like your traditional server rendered app. Reason being, you either have a front-end team and a back-end team that you have to like have these separate responsibilities, or you have to train up your team to be full stack, which I think these days is just really hard to keep up with. For instance, if you're in the .NET space, keeping up with all the ASP.NET Core stuff, and then keeping up with what's happening now in React, or Angular, or whatever it is, I think it's just really difficult to do that without spending some extra time on your own, which is just kind of a bummer, having to do it outside of work. Also, when you're using like C# with SPA front end, you end up with this disconnect where you want to share code, but you can't. Because like validation logic, for instance, like say you have say you're filling out a form and you have some required fields, but they're only required under certain circumstances. You want to share the logic that you have on the server with your client, but you really can't because they're two different languages. So you have a choice of, all right, now I got to write it in JavaScript and I got to write it in C#, or you just write it in C# and let the server take that hit. As well as you get like no IDE help when you do like an AJAX call, right? So if you're using fetch, Axios, jQuery, whatever it is, and let's say you're getting back a customer, and you're like, all right, I need the job of that customer object I'm getting back, but I don't remember if I called it job or occupation, so now I got to go look and see what I called that. Unless you bring in like yet another tool like GraphQL or something that keeps your TypeScript models in sync with your C# models. But again, that's yet another tool you have to bring into your tool chain. So now that we talked about kind of the current state of the SPA front end, let's talk about WebAssembly, or WASM, which is like a way funner thing to say than .NET. Like .NET kind of sucks to say, to be honest. But like WASM is fun to say, just saying WASM. Anyway, so WASM is a low-level binary format language that can be run in modern browsers that runs at near native speeds. So what does that mean? Well, unless you're super hardcore, you're probably not going to be writing in WebAssembly. Like mere mortals like me are probably going to just be writing in something else, like C# or Java or whatever it is. And then you're going to compile down to WebAssembly. And so WebAssembly is a browser standard that most of the modern browsers have implemented, and it gives you this little like sandbox for you to run your code at near native speeds. So in theory, your WebAssembly code can run faster than your JavaScript code. But they don't re-implement all of the DOM APIs or anything in WebAssembly. They give you like these little things that you can do with WebAssembly, and you can also shell out to JavaScript. And we'll actually take a look at that here in a second. So it's its own little sandbox and its own little island within the browser. But what this means is there's no more JavaScript monopoly. It means you have a choice now. You can pick the language that you want. As long as it compiles to WebAssembly, you can write a SPA application in that language. And we'll take a look at that here in a little bit. So you may have a question now. I said it's a browser standard, so you may think to yourself, all right, cool. It's probably only in Chrome, nothing else, right? Well, the good news is it's in all modern browsers, other than Opera Mini, which, whatever, let's just take that out for a second. Other than IE 11, which obviously IE 11, all of Microsoft support is going towards Edge, so they're not going to implement that. So you're probably like, oh, sweet, let me pack up my bags because I'm in the enterprise. That's like all my users. Or maybe all my users are like 70 plus or something, and so they just use whatever comes with Windows, so they use IE. Well, the good news is you can actually polyfill WASM with something called ASM.js. So you can get your WebAssembly working on IE 11, and everything works just fine. Now, little caveat, it will be a little slower because they're running JavaScript, not WebAssembly, but let's be honest, if they're on IE anyway, they're used to things being slow, so no big deal. So what is Blazor then? Which that is the official logo for, or sorry, it's the official icon for Blazor. It's not a logo because logo apparently means like lawyery things in Microsoft world. So it's an icon that Microsoft has provided, not a logo. So Blazor is a .NET SPA framework that's currently in preview that lets you mix C# and HTML that runs in the browser on top of that sandbox WebAssembly. So you may think to yourself, C# in the browser, I've heard this before. Isn't this just Silverlight all over again? I see some people smiling and some tears too. It's okay, it's a safe place. No, again, it's not a plugin model, it's a standard. So Steve Jobs, he's not gonna come back from the dead, hopefully. And if he does, he could kill WebAssembly, just don't kill me. But it's a standard, not a plugin, so you don't have to worry about this going away. It's been implemented in all those browsers that we looked at a second ago. So Blazor uses the Razor syntax. How many people are familiar with Razor or have done ASP.NET MVC? All right, cool, like 2/3 of the room. So it uses the Razor syntax. So for those of you who aren't familiar with it, basically the Razor syntax is just like you write some HTML, and then you want to write some C#, so you write an @ symbol, and then you can start writing C#. So if you've done React, Razor is JSX, but instead of JavaScript in curly braces, you use an @ symbol and write C#. So this is actually where the name came from, is browser plus Razor plus, let's just throw an L in there to make it sound cool, and there you get Blazor. And so the icon, it has an @ symbol in it as a reference to Razor. Blazor also uses the component-based architecture that you may be familiar with if you've done any SPA work lately. React uses this, Angular, Vue, all those. And if you haven't done anything, as long as you know like MVC patterns, MVVM, you'll pick it up super quick, and I'll show you that here in a little bit. And Blazor runs on top of this thing called Mono. How many people know what Mono is? Oh, cool, like half the room, 2/3 of the room. So Mono is what powers Xamarin. So it lets you, it's an implementation of the .NET framework, so you get the same system.whatever APIs, and it lets you write like iOS and Android games, apps. So it's what powers Xamarin under the hood. So Blazor is kind of like your UI framework on top, so it's like your ASP.NET MVC or web forms. Sorry if that gave you some traumatic experiences when I said web forms. But so Blazor's sitting on top, and then you have Mono, your runtime, so that's like your .NET Core or your .NET Framework, and then Mono sits on top of WebAssembly. So it's Blazor on top, Mono in the middle, and WebAssembly on the bottom. And so development of Blazor is led by Steve Sanderson, who you can make an argument kind of started the SPA revolution a little bit, because he was kind of in there early with Knockout. So if you're sitting there thinking like, Microsoft doesn't know anything about building SPA frameworks, Steve Sanderson knows a thing or two about building client-side applications. So if you followed along with Blazor before this, this is a fairly new announcement. It was like 3-4 weeks ago. So Blazor was experimental, but now it's in preview. And because Microsoft likes to come up with their own words and don't use things like alpha, beta, RC, I now have the pleasure of explaining to you what experimental and preview are. So experimental basically means it's like a proof of concept, right? It's something that they're just experimenting with and trying to figure out if this is even viable. Whereas preview means, hey, we're going to ship this, so it's actually coming. Whereas experimental was like kind of no commitment was attached. So preview is kind of like a beta, and experimental is kind of like a pre-alpha. So they made the announcement that they are going to ship client-side Blazor sometime here in the future, which is pretty awesome. So you may be thinking to yourself, all right, cool. I can write C# running in the browser. So what kind of C# can I write? Well, Blazor is .NET Standard 2 compliant, which means like 60, 70% of the .NET framework that you know and love can run in the browser, with a bit of an asterisk. So you are running in a sandbox in the browser. Like, does it make sense for you to just fire off some emails or like call system.io.file.delete and start deleting people's like C drives and stuff like that? Probably not. So these throw platform not supported exceptions. But a lot of the APIs do make a ton of sense with writing C# in the browser. And probably the best example is making an AJAX call. So making an AJAX call is super close to making an HTTP client call in C#. You have an endpoint, you have some headers, you return some JSON. It's really close together. And so when you make an AJAX call in Blazor, you make an HTTP client call. We'll take a look at that here in a second. Another capability of Blazor is you can call C# from JavaScript and call JavaScript from C#, which calling JavaScript from C# is probably the more interesting scenario because, like I said, you can't do everything in WebAssembly you can do in JavaScript. So you can write C# wrappers on top of JavaScript APIs to call things like local storage, which we'll look at here in a minute because I'm sick of doing slides. The payment request API, like anything you can do in the DOM, you can technically write a C# wrapper on top of it. Or what's more likely going to happen, people ship packages that wrap this stuff. So in theory, you can write a SPA application completely in C# and not have to touch JavaScript. And C# just maps to JavaScript really well. So you have async and await in JavaScript. C#'s had that for a little while. And a task in C# is really close to a promise in JavaScript. So that's how they're able to interop between these two really easily. All right, so is anybody interested in this so far? Handful. OK, I got the challenge to try and get the rest of you. It's probably like half the room. The rest of you, I don't know. I guess we'll see what happens after this slide. So why would you be interested in Blazor? So first thing, C# is a really great language. And that's not to say JavaScript isn't. However, I would say static types are winning in the JavaScript community. And as evidence of this, about half of the people who responded to the NPM survey said they write TypeScript, not JavaScript, which is kind of crazy to think like half of the people who consider themselves JavaScript developers don't actually write JavaScript. Like, how many people who consider themselves C# developers write something that compiles to C#, right? Not many. So I think this is an indication that static types are winning in the JavaScript ecosystem. So C# has that by default. Another big thing is performance. So the Tech and Power benchmarks, which kind of measures it's an independent body who measures web frameworks. And ASP.NET Core is number 7 on the Tech and Power benchmarks. And there's like 10 or 11 kind of congested at the top. And these are like every web framework known to man. So even people's like hobbies and stuff like that. So even not real web servers are above ASP.NET Core. So it's probably more like number 3, number 4. But where it currently stands, it's 8 times faster than Node, 1.5 times faster than Netty, which is a popular Java one, 47 times faster than Django, 7 times faster than Kotlin. It laps PHP like a million times over, and so on and so forth. And what's more is this is ASP.NET Core 2.2, 3.0. They've improved the performance by over 40% and reduced the memory by over 90%. So I wouldn't be surprised if they end up number 1 on that list, even on the not real frameworks. So they're continually investing in performance. So that's another reason why you may be interested in using C#. The other reason is you can actually share that validation logic that I mentioned earlier. So like that scenario of something's required under certain circumstances, you can share that logic with your front end and your back end. As well as you can share those models that I mentioned earlier with like your customer object or customer class and retrieve those from the client and get your full IntelliSense. So I'll show that here in a second. But I think the biggest one is you can consolidate your front end and your back end teams or your full stack team under one single language. You don't have to learn two different testing libraries. You don't have to learn two different HTTP libraries. You just learn how to do it in C# and have it go all the way down, which is really handy. All right, so I'm going to start doing a demo, if that's cool with all of you, because I'm sick of talking. So if I want to create a new Blazor application, I'm just going to fire up Visual Studio here. I'm going to say create new project. And you actually select ASP.NET Core application. So I'm going to say next. Web application 37 sounds wonderful. And you're going to get a few different options. Oh, this whole podium moves. That's cool. You have a few different options. So you have Blazor ASP.NET Core hosted, which means you have an ASP.NET Core API backend. You can have just a straight up Blazor client-side app. So technically, you could have Blazor running with a different backend, different API backend. So you could have Blazor on the front end with Node on the back end, just to role reverse, and have JavaScript on the server and C# on the client. And then there's also this Blazor server side, which we'll talk about what that is and why I'm not a huge fan of it, but I'm going to mention it anyway. So I'm going to choose Blazor ASP.NET Core hosted because that's the more interesting one. So what this is going to do is it's going to create me 3 different projects. It's going to create me a client project, a server project, and a shared project. And you can probably guess what all 3 of those do. So if I come over here, there's my client project with all my Blazor code. There's my server project with my controller that does the API call. And then I have a shared project that has a weather forecast model in it. So if I crack that open, everybody see that? That code in the back? Looks good? All right. So this code is on my API. So if I go to my server project, there's the weather forecast model right there. And then we'll take a look in a second on it running client side as well when we consume it. But before we go too deep into the code, let's just look at what this application is doing, because I think it might make more sense if we look at what it's doing before we look at the code. So we just have some normal markup here. This piece is a little interesting, and we'll take a look at why, because it looks super lame right now. But if I go to this counter component, you can click the button, and it increments. And you keep clicking, and it keeps incrementing. And that's Blazor. So see you guys. Have fun at PubConf. No, not really. But if you watch when I go to this fetch data, this is actually going to do an API call, and you'll see a loading screen, a little loading message happen for a second, and then it'll actually do the actual API call. So it kind of shows you how to do some basic things with Blazor out of the box. So let's go ahead and start looking at the code for this. So if I go to the client project and go to, so everything's under /pages by default, and all of the Blazor files have a .razor extension. This used to be .cshtml, which if you come from the ASP.NET MVC background, that'll be very familiar to you. But they changed it to .razor because it lets you get even better IntelliSense and some better tooling and stuff like that. So they've made that change, but that's not a huge deal. So let's crack open. Let's crack open the counter component. So you give it this page directive, and then say this is available at /counter, which is something I forgot to call out. So if I come back to the code, you notice I'm at /counter. Go to home, goes to home, go to fetch data, it changes it to fetch data. So Blazor gives you client-side routing out of the box. And so this is saying, hey, this component's available at /counter. Some standard markup here. And then here's where things start to get a little interesting. So it says, hey, here's the current count. And it's referencing this C# here that says @current_count. Which if you go to this functions block here, you'll see on line 10, there's a current count variable that starts at 0, and then on this button, there's an onClick that calls a C# method called increment count. And all it does is current count plus plus. So pretty simple code, pretty self-explanatory what all that does. So let's look at a more interesting scenario. Let's look at an API call. So again, I have the page directive and the route saying this is available at /fetchData. That just brings in a namespace. So for those of you from JavaScript, this is like an import. And then I'm saying, inject me an HTTP client that's pre-configured to start hitting my API. And we'll take a look at how we use this HTTP variable in a second. Some boring markup. And then it says, if forecast is null, show that loading thing that we saw for 2 seconds, or for not even 2 seconds, a couple seconds. Otherwise, loop over all the data and drop this into a table. So if you've done ASP.NET MVC, this should look really, really familiar to you. And again, we've got an @functions block where we've got some of our dynamic code that's running client side. And here's that forecast variable we were looking at earlier. And then Blazor gives you these events you can subscribe to. So if you come from a React background, on-init async is like component did mount. And you can say, hey, set my forecast to this HTTP call. So that HTTP client I injected earlier, get some JSON back, and then cast it to an array of weather forecasts. And hit this API at this endpoint. So this lets me get that strongly typedness. So if I come over here to forecast and type in here, I get that nice IntelliSense. So imagine doing this in JavaScript. If you're using some sort of fetch or Axios or just jQuery to make this AJAX call, you wouldn't get this IntelliSense like you would with Blazor. So that's pretty cool that you get that out of the box. And so that is the fetch data component. So let's look at the home page because I said that was a little more interesting. So again, it's saying this is available at the root. Here's some markup. And then there's a survey prompt tag, which I'm sure most of you can see where this is going. Blazor, this is an actual Blazor component. And from the parent component, I'm able to change the behavior by passing it a title so that how is Blazor working for you matches up to this how is Blazor working for you. So I could change what that title is by passing something different into it. So let's just go ahead and make our own component. So I'm going to make an alert component. How many people have done Bootstrap? Use Bootstrap, the CSS framework? Most of the room? All right, so Bootstrap has the concept of alerts. And they have all sorts of different types of alerts. So you can have like alert-danger for a dark red one, alert-info for blue one, that kind of thing. And in fact, that survey prompt, this is an alert right here. It's just a call out. It's that dark gray background. But I want all my alerts to look the same. So I'm just going to make add an @ here. I'm just going to make my own alert component. So if I make an enum, so I'm just going to call this alert types, and just say info and warning is fine for now. And how you pass in that title that you saw earlier is you make a variable or a property that you decorate with a parameter attribute, and that lets somebody change it downstream. So I can just say, hey, I want an alert type. And so this means somebody upstream can say whether they want an info or warning alert type. So if I make a getCSS class method here, and I'll just switch on alert type, I'm going to say, hey, when it's an info one, return alert-info. Just copy and paste like a good programmer, and say warning is going to return alert-warning. And then the default, I'm just going to throw an exception because you did something crazy. So then I can drop that getCSS class right here and just say, hey, based on whatever they passed in, change what the alert is. But the problem is, like, I want to change like some of this dynamic content here, but I want to pass in like my own HTML. Well, Blazor gives you a way to do that by, again, taking a parameter and using something called a render fragment. So I'm just going to call this child content, and I'll just drop that child content right here. So what this is going to do is upstream, so I'm going to save this because that's probably important. I'm going to get rid of the survey prompt here, and just say, hey, I want an alert. And I didn't even build or anything, and I'm already getting IntelliSense. If I could stop moving for a half second. Already getting IntelliSense for that alert component that I created. What's more, I'm also getting IntelliSense for the parameter that I just gave it. So hey, I said, hey, this is an alert type, and I get full IntelliSense for that. So now I'm going to have to bring in the whole namespace here, or I could just bring in a using statement, but I'll just give it the whole namespace. So again, I'm getting the full IntelliSense saying, hey, this is a certain kind of alert type. So I'm going to say, hey, this is an info. Zoom out. And now here's where I want to pass that dynamic HTML. So I can pass in and say, hello, NDC. And I'll just save and rebuild here. And what should happen is I should have an alert with a dark red or dark blue background and some content in the middle that says hello, NDC. Did I say MVC earlier? And NDC. And so that's what I get. So if I want to change this to warning, I can just switch that, and now my background of my alerts will be dark yellow or light yellow. So what this is, so those of you who have done React or Angular, this will feel really familiar. But you can actually make these components and make some common component library that all of your applications at your company use. So all of your alerts look the same. So if you want to make dismissible alerts, like with a little X there that lets you close it out, you could totally do that. So I showed you kind of like hello world on Blazor, some components, we looked at dependency injection with the HTTP client, and we looked at some sharing logic between the two. So if I were you, I would probably have some random questions. So I'm just going to hit those random questions now. So you may think to yourself, all right, cool, .NET Core or .NET Framework is like 80, 100 megs. So are we loading 80 or 100 meg in the browser? And the answer is no. We're loading 2.4 megabytes, which still is not stellar. But just to prove to you, I will go to the network tab here and disable my cache, if I could click. And go ahead and refresh. And you can see there it's 2.4 megs, which some of this is like Bootstrap and stuff, but it's right around 2.3, 2.4 megs. What's interesting here is, if I scroll up, you'll notice I'm actually loading DLLs. We'll talk about why that is here in a second. But 2.4 megs obviously isn't ideal, but a lot of people can get away with that, to be honest. Like if you're on an internal application, you can probably get away with that, but they're going to make it, they're going to keep improving this because they know this isn't great. So you may ask yourself, all right, do WASM files cache, and do those DLLs that we saw cache just like regular JavaScript files? And the answer is yes. So if I enable my cache and look back down here, you can see it's 12K. So you pay that cost once, and then you're good to go from that point on. So how does it work under the hood? Oops. Zoom out. So how does Blazor work? So at dev time, so like when I'm making those changes to those components, it generates me DLLs on the fly. And those DLLs are loaded in the browser and read from the Mono runtime, which is actually compiled to full WebAssembly. So it's loading your DLLs on the browser, which is a little like trippy, as is this whole thing. And then Mono reads it on the fly and loads your DLLs for you. And then Mono talks to the browser APIs. Where they want to get to in the future is you take your DLLs and you further compile them down to WASM files, which improves performance. But it's a little slower to, like when you're deving, it's a little slower to do that because now you got another compilation step. So what they're thinking is like at dev time, they'll be like on the left side here. And then when you go to publish, it'll generate you WASM files so that your code executes a little faster. But they're still working on that. So the next question you may ask yourself is why Mono and why not .NET Core? Like, isn't .NET Core the latest hotness? Well, the reason is Mono is already client-side focused. So Mono powers Xamarin, it powers Unity for making games, whereas .NET Core is kind of more server-side focused and kind of anticipates being run like on an OS or something like that. And Mono is already developed for like really constrained platforms like TVs, watches, PS4, that kind of thing. So they kind of just like got it working first is a big thing. But they also have a linker, which is like trims out the DLLs you're not using, because they need that for Xamarin to try and reduce installation size. And I can show you that working right down here. So right here in Visual Studio, if I zoom in, you can see it's deleting the assemblies you're not using. So it's saying, hey, you're not using system.componentModel.composition. Let me go ahead and delete that out. But I am using system.net.http for HTTP client. So let me go ahead and keep that in. So this is how you get that 80, 100 meg framework down to 2.4 megs. Like I said, they just kind of got it working here first. Long term, like this is the fun part about giving a talk right when Microsoft Build's going on, is they release new things. So like I got to scan real quick, like what announcements did they make? And now I got to go update my slides. So have people heard of .NET 5 that just got announced this week? Handful? So .NET 5 is a unified framework for .NET Core, Mono, and full framework. So what you can think of it as is they're going to take .NET Core and take in pieces of Mono and make like the part where Mono like trims things out and can run on unique platforms. They're going to take the best of that and put it in .NET Core. And maybe they'll take something out of full framework too. I don't know. I don't know if there's anything worthwhile there. But this will give you a single runtime to target mobile, web, and desktop. So no longer do you have to worry about, oh, am I using Mono or .NET Core? You'll just use .NET 5. So the name .NET Core will kind of go away. There will still be ASP.NET Core, but the name .NET Core will kind of go away. And the reason why they chose 5 was because Microsoft is historically really bad at versioning, and this is no different. So currently they're on .NET Core 3.0, or it's in preview right now. And they have .NET Framework, which is like 4.8, 4.6, all that kind of stuff. So they chose 5 because 5 is higher than 4 for .NET Framework, and because 5 is higher tgoing 3. So they're kind of pulling the Angular move, where Angular went from like 2 to 4 for similar-ish reasons. They are going to call this future .NET 5. And this is coming out in November 2020. Which probably means sometime mid-2021, because that's kind of how Microsoft rolls. Oh, this is recorded, isn't it? Oh, this is going to be lovely. All right. Totally not going to be an MVP anytime soon, but that's cool. So what I'm going to show you next is writing C# and interacting with local storage, which is a JavaScript-only API. So if I run this application here, is anybody familiar with To-Do MVC? Handful? Yep. So what this is just a simple to-do app that lets people write in their framework of choice, and they can compare and contrast it. So I wrote one for Blazor, so it's really fancy. You say like what tasks you want to do, and then you can like check them off and delete them. Really fancy. But what's cool is when I refresh, my tasks stayed right there. Even if I check them off, I refresh and they stay right there. Now, how did that happen? Well, I am using something called local storage, which lets you store some data in the browser. So you probably don't want to do this for anything sensitive, but for tasks, it's perfectly fine. So I'm storing some local storage here, some data in local storage here, and all it is a key and a value, both strings. But if I come over here to my code and I scroll up, you'll see there is no JavaScript whatsoever here, even though I'm interacting with JavaScript. And the reason is I've wrapped it in this local storage class. So you can kind of think of like people are going to start shipping NuGet packages that kind of wrap common JavaScript things you want to do. And you can just write C# and not have to worry about JavaScript and not have to potentially write JavaScript for making a Blazor application. Is anybody interested in not writing JavaScript to make a SPA front end? All right, like half the room, 2/3 of the room? Cool. So that's what that demo is showing, is technically you can just stay in your little C# world and not have to worry about JavaScript ever again, which is pretty cool. All right, so what else can we do with Blazor? So the cool thing is Blazor's component model is completely decoupled from the browser because it turns out Steve Sanderson and Microsoft are pretty smart people. So this means you can run Blazor on something called Electron. People familiar with Electron? And all right, like half the room. So Electron is a cross-platform desktop framework that lets you use web technologies and have a desktop application run on Windows, Mac, and Linux. It's what VS Code is built on top of, the Atom editor, like the Slack app as well. And so this gives you the theory of write once, run anywhere, which is usually a lie, but that's OK. I'll continue to perpetuate that, I guess. So they have a proof of concept of running Blazor on top of .NET Core on top of Electron. If this wasn't crazy enough. So you get the full access to the debugger in Visual Studio. You're running on .NET Core instead of Mono, which in the future, that .NET 5 thing, we'll figure that out anyway. And then you have access to the native desktop APIs. So let's just go ahead and look at Blazor on Electron. So I'm just going to go ahead and run the app here. And to zoom in and prove I have a desktop app here, here's the Electron, I guess is what it's called, Electron. Sample running my desktop application. And surprise, surprise, it's the exact same application where you can click and increment, call fetch data, and so on and so forth. So in theory, this means you can write a single application for client-side Blazor and a single application to also run on the desktop with a few caveats that maybe on the desktop you want access to desktop-y things like the clipboard, deleting people's C drives, that kind of thing. Whatever you want to do, as long as they have access from their user, you can do in the desktop. So what else can we do with Blazor? So you can actually run Blazor running fully on the server. And so this is it feels client-side, but actually all of the state is managed on the server. And then those changes are streamed over SignalR through WebSockets back to the browser. Why would you want to do this? It's a smaller bundle size, so it's only 400K instead of 2.4 megs. Your code now runs on the .NET Core server, not client-side, and so you have no constraints, and you have the full debugger in VS. Why not? Obviously, it puts more load on your server, and currently it does not support disconnects very well either. So let's go ahead and look at Blazor on the server. So when I did file new application, there's that Blazor server-side option, and so that's what this is here. So it's the same exact application we saw earlier. So I can click, I can fetch data, that kind of thing, but it's round-tripping to the server every time. So when I click, round trips to the server streams back the data and says, oh, you called a click action. Let me just send you this little piece of information that you need to update back down to the client, and then it updates that to a 1. So if we take a look at the network tab here and refresh, we can go to the WebSockets, open up this WebSocket, move this up a little bit. And so when I click, you can see this message round trips back to the server. So I'll keep clicking, and you can see, maybe not be able to see very well, but the data is round tripping back to the server. So that's also an option for Blazor. So some other people are getting really interested in Blazor right now, and those are the normal suspects of third-party component libraries. So people like Telerik, people like Syncfusion, people like DevExpress. And Telerik actually released 1.0 of their components last week. So they're going all in on Blazor as well. So what's the current status of Blazor then? So I can tell you what is there currently. So we have the component model that I showed earlier. We have routing. We have layouts, which I didn't really go over, but that's just MVC layouts and just kind of the outer shell of your application. Dependency injection, calling JavaScript from C# that I showed earlier with the local storage demo. You can actually share components between projects, so you can get that consistent look and feel across all of your different applications. You can debug C# in Chrome, which is a little but you can't do it in VS quite yet, but they're working on it. You can do forms and validation, so the normal data annotation stuff you can do with Blazor as well. It has full Visual Studio support and some VS Code, and I know they're working on Visual Studio for Mac as well. And you can run Blazor server-side and on Electron, and they're also working on getting server-side rendering to work, which if you've done SPAs, you may be familiar with that term. So that's like getting where when you run a Blazor app, it says that loading screen for a second. Basically, it could do all that logic on the server and stream that down to the client, so you have no loading. You get like an initial, quick initial paint, and then Blazor picks it up from there. So they're really close on that. I tried to get that working, but it's like pulling in pull requests and branches, and it's a little crazy. And I'm already running like preview stuff, so I figured that probably was a really bad idea. Anyway, but what's coming? They want to get better tooling. They want to get hot reloading, so like you save and your browser auto refreshes. They're working on the ahead of time compilation so that they're compiling the DLLs down to WASM files. They want to get that bundle size down smaller. They're working on some authentication authorization work, so detecting whether or not you have the right claims or roles, whether you're logged in or not. They're getting that working as well, and they'll probably ship that in the next month or two. And then they also want to get debugging in full Visual Studio, which is really close to working as well. So if we call back to Corey House's decision tree that you have to make when you make a JavaScript application, it turns out when you use Blazor, a lot of these just kind of fade away because they're just not applicable. And the remainder of these that are left, you've probably already made on the back end. Things like, what testing library are you using? You're probably going to keep using XUnit, MSTest, NUnit, or my favorite, end users, that kind of thing. And so you only have one set of tools to worry about, and you don't have to learn how do I test React, how do I test Angular, and how do I test my C# backend. You just have to worry about how do I test C#, and everything else is a lot easier to maintain. So if this is the current state of the SPA front end, maybe the future state, and I will say besides JavaScript, so don't come yelling at me. I'm not saying JavaScript's going away. I'm saying besides those previous choices, maybe you have more options. So you can pick whether you want to use C#, Java, Python, Rust, Go, C++, and some sick person made COBOL running on WebAssembly because, I don't know, they like inflicting pain on the world, I guess. I don't know. But then you can, sorry if anybody's a COBOL fan. I hear it pays well because not many people know it anymore. But then you can pick your framework that you want. So do you want Blazor or something called Uno, which is a way where you can run XAML and have it run client-side. So if you like the more Silverlight XAML model, you can pick up something called Uno. Or We, you can bring in something called We, which is a community project to run C# on top of WebAssembly. Or one of these other languages might come out with something new. Who knows? And then you can pick your tools. Like maybe they're more integrated, like everything's in Visual Studio or in IntelliJ or VS Code, and everything's more, you're not stitching together all these different things. And I would argue the JavaScript community is kind of going this way anyway. Things like Create React App, Angular CLI, Vue CLI, they're kind of realizing that maybe we should package some of these tools together so people don't have to set up all that stuff every single time. So in the future, Blazor is currently 3.0 Preview 5. And client-side Blazor, as I mentioned earlier, is no longer experimental, which means it will be shipped sometime in the future. But server-side Blazor will actually ship with .NET Core 3.0, which will probably come out in the next 2-3 months. Not really sure. I don't work at Microsoft, so if it's less or more, don't come yelling at me. But I'm going to guess .NET Core 3.0 is going to ship in about 2 to 3 months. So that was that WebAssembly technology I showed earlier. They're going to actually ship that, and you can use that in production and get Microsoft support, which is pretty cool. However, I wouldn't bet my company on Blazor just yet. I've built a few internal tools on top of Blazor, and like that Dad Jokes app that I showed earlier. But I would not bet my company on Blazor just yet, just because it's really early, it's still preview technology and all that kind of stuff. So just saying that because if something happens to Blazor, I don't want you coming after me because you bet your whole company on it and something happened to it or it went away or took forever to actually release. So what I hope you got out of this is I hope you think that WASM is awesome, which I really wish I came up with that, but I saw it on a podcast, like that was the title of the podcast. So full disclosure, I did not come up with that. But hopefully you think WASM is awesome, like I do. And hopefully you see the potential of Blazor and WebAssembly in the future, because I think this has a chance to radically change how we do web development in the future. Like if you go back to the slide where I had all those JavaScript technologies, like how many of those were around 5 years ago? Maybe half, maybe. So the web just moves at a ridiculous pace, and I think WebAssembly could also insert itself in there and radically change how we build web apps. One thing you can start thinking about today is this code I'm writing okay to run in the browser? So stuff like validation. So say you've got a login page which has a username and password, and hopefully both are required. Hopefully at least like you don't let anybody log in as any username. And so that's like input validation, right? So that's like, hey, this input field is required, and I don't have to go check a database or check an API to see if this field's required. I can just do that all just in pure logic. So that can run perfectly fine client-side. But something like checking if the user is locked out requires you checking a database or checking an API or whatever it is. So that's something that's more domain validation and something you should maybe put in a separate method or class or whatever you want to do. But maybe don't put those two things together, because when you go to run that on Blazor, it's going to blow up at you. So maybe you can start thinking about, hey, is this code cool to run in the browser? So if you're like, OK, cool, this sounds awesome. How do I get started? It's kind of awkward right now, to be honest with you. But if you Google like Blazor getting started, it'll give you these details. So you got to download the .NET Core Preview SDK. Even though Visual Studio 2019 is out, you have to run a preview version of Visual Studio 2019. Install the latest Blazor extension if you're using Visual Studio. And then also install the templates at the command line. In the future, when this releases, obviously they're just going to make it, you just download one thing and you get all the things. But that's what it is currently right now. So some resources for you. The official Microsoft documentation, since this is now an official Microsoft product, is at blazor.net, which blazor.net, haha, haha. Jokes are always better when you explain them, is the official Microsoft documentation. So if you want to get started with Blazor, all those steps I just mentioned will be found right there, as well as like the common things you might want to do in Blazor, like validation and all that sort of stuff. There's also some community-led documentation, learn-blazor.net, which kind of goes into some even more, deeper scenarios. And since this is the new Microsoft, of course, the code is open source out on GitHub. And if you're interested in what other languages are doing with WebAssembly, those are two links that are really good that kind of show you, hey, where's Python at, or where's Java at, and it tells you like the Blazor equivalent of some of these other languages. So that's also cool to see as well. And these slides are also up at my blog, just my first and last name, scottsauber.com. So if you want to download these, you can feel free. That's why I keep them kind of detailed, just so if you're reviewing back, you can see what I said instead of having to skim through a video or something like that. So we have like 7 minutes, although I did say I would let you guys go for PubConf, but I finished a little early. So I guess I'll just take any questions you might have. Assume there's at least one. Maybe not. No, 3. Yep. 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 So currently you cannot debug in Visual Studio using client-side Blazor. Sorry, the question was, what's the debugging story for Blazor right now? So the debugging story is you can't debug client-side Blazor, but a nice little trick that some people do is you can actually toggle the server-side Blazor really quick. So if you hit an issue, you'll see it in the console. So it'll give you like a bunch of red in the console and tell you like a null reference exception, which kind of gives you a clue anyway. but you can actually switch to server-side Blazor real quick and then get full debugging in Visual Studio, and then figure out what the problem is, change it, and switch back to client-side Blazor super easily. So it's actually pretty decent and works pretty well. But that's something that they want to improve, obviously, and just get it natively working with Visual Studio so you don't have to do that little bait and switch thing. I think you had a question? Yep. So the question was, will Bootstrap ever not be included in the template? So currently, it is included in the template, but you can just get rid of all of Bootstrap if you want and bring in whatever CSS you want to do. But I don't think they have any plans to remove it out of the template, just because people, like most of the room, raise their hands about knowing Bootstrap, so it's just a familiar thing for people. But you totally can use Blazor with any front-end technology or front-end CSS framework, or just roll your own. Any other questions? Yep.
It wasn't not anywhere close to being ready for a serious business app. If you were writing, say, a hobby app that was actually a real app,
yep.
At what point would you think it would be ready? Like for your personal.
Yep. So the question was, so Blazor's not ready for prime time quite yet. Is it ready for hobby projects, essentially? Is that your question?
Or when will we know when that is?
So I would say it's probably going to get released. Again, I don't work for Microsoft, but I would probably say it's going to get released in the next 6 to 12 months. Because if you saw that list of what's not there, it's pretty close of stuff to at least people get started. And then people can get started with the 2.4 megs and they can work on it as they go. I would say the biggest holdup is the mono WebAssembly runtime. They're still trying to iron out a few kinks out of there. So I would say in the next 6 to 12 months, they'll probably release Blazor client-side, would be my guess. But if you've got a hobby project, I would honestly consider using Blazor, as long as you're not planning on going like super big with it and betting like a company. That might be a little more apprehensive, but it's kind of up to your risk tolerance. But we're using it for some internal dashboards and works just fine. I saw a few other questions. Yep. Yep, so the question was, should it work with progressive web apps since it's web technology? Yep, absolutely, and that's something that they care a lot about, and they want to make sure that it works with that. So, yep, definitely does. Any other questions? Is everybody hungry? All right, I'll keep you for the next 5 minutes then, since, right? All right, never mind. All right, thanks everybody, and again, in the after parties at PubConf at Amsterdam Barn Hall. And again, slides are on my blog if you're interested.